Alrighty, hello everybody. How is it going today? I'm feeling a little bit sick today, which is a bummer, but we're still gonna keep this going, and I'm gonna make sure that I mute my computer over here so that I can't hear myself. Maybe I'll just pause that. I like to keep two computers here, one for chat so I can see what's going on, and then one for just working so I can keep that stuff separate. So I want to talk a little bit about first what we're going to be building and kind of how we're going to be doing it, and then we're going to get into it. So I have a podcast called Full Stack Radio that you might have heard of or you might listen to. And I have sponsors on this podcast, and it's a real pain for me to manage that stuff. I have to deal with a lot of emails back and forth, sending invoices, asking people how many episodes do you want to sponsor? Here's an invoice based on that sort of thing. So I'd like to try and simplify this process for myself a little bit. At least to start, and then hopefully a bit down the road. So I started hacking on just like some ideas of what an interface might look like for a very simple tool that let me do sort of self-serve sponsorships, where if someone was interested in sponsoring the podcast, I could kind of talk to them and then send them to this page where they could go and choose the episodes that were still unsponsored or available that they wanted to sponsor, sort of build up a little cart with the stuff that they wanted to add, and then they could just go ahead and check out and pay for that sponsorship with their credit card using Stripe. And then once this is done, I'll get an email just sort of notifying me saying, hey, company XYZ purchased some sponsorships on your podcast. You should kind of reach out to them and find out what they want you to mention, what they want included in the show notes, that sort of thing. So the way that we're going to build this app is we're going to try and build it basically backwards. So I think a big mistake that a lot of people make when they're working on a new side project or working on a new application is getting caught up in a lot of the peripheral details that don't actually deliver value, that don't actually make the product something worth using. It's very easy to get stuck up doing like login screens and registration and creating a backend where someone could go and create these podcast episodes and mark whether they're sponsored or not. Just all these sort of dependencies that you imagine having to exist before you can finally get to the important part of the app, which is where potential sponsors can come in and actually purchase sponsorships on the podcast. So instead of getting kind of caught in the weeds building all that stuff that's sort of like dependencies of this, we're going to focus on actually building this feature, the feature where a sponsor can come to the page and purchase stuff. And that's the very first thing that we're going to do. And once we're done that, we'll actually have enough of an app that I can put it into production and deploy it. Because what you have to realize is that every single little annoying kind of stuck in the weeds feature that you think of as a dependency that needs to exist before this stuff, a lot of that stuff can be done in different ways or can be done manually. So a good example here is, you might think that we need to build UI and build features around letting me log in and add new episodes to my account and set the prices and set the names and set the dates and stuff like that. But the reality is, I don't actually have to build that for this screen and this feature to work. There's other ways that I can get that data into the system. For example, I can just open SQL Pro, go to the episodes table, and just add new records to it. Like SQL Pro to me is like the best MVP admin interface of all time. So we're going to be really focused on trying to do this in like a lean way and taking anything that could be done manually and letting that be done manually and just focus on building out this one key feature. And then when we're done that, I'll be able to deploy this to production, and sponsors will be able to come to this page and buy sponsorships, and I won't have had to build login or any of that stuff yet. I can add that stuff after. Even if I wanted to bring on someone else as an additional customer that wanted to use this, they could just send me an email saying, oh, here's a list of my upcoming episodes. Can you add those to the system under my account? And I could totally do that manually. So we're going to try and dodge a lot of that stuff that's going to keep us out of building the important stuff and just focus on kind of getting this done. So, where should we start? So I have a little kind of like to-do list that I'm working on, kind of like an in-progress to-do list. I have just enough stuff kind of defined that we can work on it, and we'll be coming back to this note and sort of adding new stuff. Anytime we run into a situation where we're like, oh, we better not forget to do this, we'll make sure that we add it to this list so we can get it done. So the order that we're going to build things in is we're going to TDD the backend for actually viewing this page where you can see a list of the episodes that you want to sponsor. So we'll TDD out that page first, and I got a couple things that we need to check for. And then we're going to test drive the actual AJAX request that someone makes to the backend with the Stripe token and stuff like that to actually purchase the sponsorships and get all that stuff working. And then once we have kind of the whole backend TDD'd and everything kind of built out and working there, then we're going to build this whole template with Tailwind, just as sort of a static template first to just sort of get everything in place. And then we're going to use Vue to make it interactive and dynamic. So we'll take this like static list of episodes and make it be based on the dynamic list that's generated from the back end, and make it so that, you know, you can click these and activate them, hit pay now, and have it open this modal and all that sort of stuff. So that's sort of the process that I think we're going to take. So I haven't done basically anything yet. We're really going to be building this more or less from scratch. The only thing that I did do is I created a brand new Laravel project, initialized a Git repository, and made a commit, just the init commit. I literally haven't changed a single line of code in the default Laravel install. So we've just created a brand new Laravel 5.6 app, and now I'm basically going to walk you through the steps that I would take to sort of get things in place. So even though we're going to start with the back end, so what I was thinking is I have a Laravel front end preset that I use to set up Tailwind and Vue and some of the other stuff that I like to use. But yeah, let's install that first anyways, even though we're not going to be doing the front end stuff first, just to make sure that all the scaffolding is in place so we don't accidentally blow out any files or anything after the fact that we need. So we're just going to use this to basically create like my Laravel sort of boilerplate. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to add this repositories key to our composer.json file. So we're pulling in my Laravel preset here, and then we'll just install it through the command line. So all this does is install Tailwind for the front end, set up purge CSS, set up Vue the way that I like it, which is not really any real differences there, just making sure we're on the latest version and stuff like that. Removes Bootstrap and jQuery since we don't need that. I used to have this pull in CSS Next, but now I'm just pulling in CSS nesting because that's the only feature I used from CSS Next, and CSS Next has been deprecated in favor of post CSS preset env now. But that adds a lot of stuff that I don't want right away, and I don't want to go through the trouble of configuring it all and disabling a bunch of features. It also adds a simple Tailwind layout. So it kind of gets rid of this Laravel homepage and stuff like that and replaces it with some simpler Blade default templates. And that's basically it. So once we've got that in place, we just have to run the NothingWorks artisan preset and run yarn so we can kind of get everything installed. And then we can kind of take a look at the folder structure and make sure that we got everything that we want. I haven't put the package on packages yet because I wasn't sure if I wanted to change the name of it, and it's annoying to change the name of it when you do it that way. So whatever, this is fine for me. Okay, so now that we've got that set up, let's head over to Sublime here. And you can see we kind of pulled in a couple different dependencies in our yarn setup here. The most interesting things really is just I changed the views, so we have like a basic app layout, and then we have a welcome template that extends that layout. So it's kind of a more natural starting point if you're going to be building everything based on an app layout. But now that that's done, we don't really have to do any front-end related stuff. So why don't we just create a commit here anyways. So let's add a commit. We'll just say scaffold or setup NothingWorks preset scaffolding. All right. So now that we're kind of done with that, I think the first thing that we want to do is write some tests, right? Because we're trying to do TDD here. Can't write any code before we write any tests. So like I was saying, the first thing that I want to focus on is being able to view that purchase sponsorship page, which is this page. So we want to write a test to kind of drive this out and make sure that we're sending the correct data to it. So why don't we start by running artisan make test, and we'll call it new sponsorship test. I think it'll be a feature test. And now that we have that in place, let's head over to our tests folder and take a look. So we can delete this example test. We don't need that. New sponsorship test. So we'll delete this example test and we'll just start with our own test here. So a lot of the time when I'm starting on a new test for a new feature, I like to start with a really generic test that I might rename or refine as I add additional cases. So in this case, we want to make sure that all the sponsorship slots are passed to the view. So in this case, these episodes are each kind of like slots. So why don't we just call this test something really generic and straightforward, like viewing the new sponsorship page. And we might come back and rename this test, like I mentioned, because if we add other tests that are kind of identifying more specific cases, it might become more clear what case we're actually trying to test here. Okay, so a lot of the time what I like to do is write my tests backwards. So I start with the things that I want to verify, so my assertions, and then I move back to the act phase. So what did I want to do that would cause me to have this state that I'm verifying? And then I'll move back even further to what is all the setup that I need to do to make it possible for that act phase to work. So let's start with some assertions. So we're going to have a response that comes back after we make a request. And we're going to want to make some assertions about what happened in that response, right? So in this case, I think we want to make sure that we got like a 200 back. I think there's an assert okay. No, assert response okay. Or test response. Let's see. It has assert successful. Yeah, assert successful seems fine. We could do specifically 200, but I think assert successful is kind of a nice way to do it. I use snake case for test names because a lot of the time my test names are really long and I find it a little bit more readable. Okay, so we want to assert that the response is successful. And we're going to want to make sure that, okay, so the interesting thing, some people like to do this in different ways, but the way that I like to test the data that was sent to the view is not to make assertions about the rendered HTML. I just want to make assertions about the actual models that were passed to the view. I find it lets you be a lot more targeted with your testing and write tests that are a lot less brittle. And there's other ways that you can make sure that your test suite will fail if you're doing bad things in your templates. So what I like to do normally is I like to do something like response, and I like to be able to get the data from the response, right? So in this case, I might do something like, this isn't a method. We're going to have to add this as a macro, which is what I do on most projects. But we can basically ask for the specific data that was sent to this view based on the key that it was passed into the view as. So we have to kind of decide on what name do we want this stuff to be available in the view as. So this is a tricky problem for me because I want to make this app usable for people who are not just making podcasts, but maybe other things that they want to sponsor too. I don't want to get too generic, but I would like it to work for at least like newsletters, for example. So why don't we call it something like, so what I was thinking is I'm thinking I might have like a podcast be like a sponsorable, and then each slot could be like a sponsorable slot. So why don't we look for some data in the view called sponsorable slots and make some assertions about it. So why don't we say that there's 3 items. We won't do it based exactly on this view, but let's just say that there's going to be 3. So let's say assert count 3 response data sponsorable slots. And then why don't we make an assertion to make sure that these sponsorable slots specifically match some existing Eloquent models that we have. So a lot of the time what I'll do is I'll have something like sponsorable slots that we'll create in our setup phase earlier. And we could actually bake an assertion directly into this if we wanted to, which is something that I do a lot with these Eloquent collections. So we could say something like assert equals, and then pass through these ones. And I think that's probably enough for us to start working on the other parts of this test to get this working. We can decide later if there's other stuff that we want to send to the view, but I think for now we actually only really care about sending through the slots. Okay, so where are we going to get this response from? So this is kind of the first step. Now that we have our assertions, we can run this test and we can see, okay, well, there's no response. So we have to get a response from somewhere. So we'll get the response by making a GET request to some URL, right? So we have to decide on the URL. So I kind of like the idea of making the URL something like, say, fullstackradio/sponsorships/new. Because this page, if we're thinking about it in like a RESTful way, this is really a page to like, it's kind of like the create form for a new sponsorship, right? By default, I think Laravel used to encourage create for these sorts of things, but since PHP 7 lets you use new as a function name, I kind of like using new instead of create. All right, so we're going to hit this sponsorships new page, and let's see what we get now. Okay, so now we get response status code 404 is not a successful status code. So let's disable exception handling. So let's say this without exception handling. And actually, let's just move that down here. We'll just chain that. And let's just see what happens. Okay, so we're getting an exception, not found HTTP exception. That route does not exist, basically. I have a package that I wrote that David Hemphill helped me with, where I have a keyboard shortcut that lets me run just this test, a keyboard shortcut that lets me run the whole file, that sort of thing. It's called Sublime PHP Unit or something. I'll find a link to it and share it at some point. Maybe someone can find it on my GitHub and post it in the chat. Okay, so we're getting an error that there is no route. So let's go to the route web folder. We'll get rid of this default route, and we'll add a get route that goes to the sponsorable, we'll call it a slug, because these are going to have to be unique, right? Because that's going to be like full stack radio, /sponsorships/new. So we could just have this be a closure, right? And that'll get us a little bit further in our test, but that's not going to get us to the design that we want to get to. So I say, like, when you're in this situation, you want to kind of write the code that you wish you had. You want to program by wishful thinking. So we want to point this route at our sponsorships, at our sponsorable sponsorships controller, at the new method. So the when I have like a nested resource like this, I like to include the parent resource in the name of the controller, because I might want just another sponsorships controller later. I did a whole talk on this sort of thing called Cruddy by Design that you can look up if you're interested in that. But yeah, these are the sponsorships for a specific sponsorable. So this controller doesn't exist yet, but we're pretending that we don't know that. We're pretending that all that doesn't exist is a route, and we just want to point it at the existing controller. And now our tests are going to tell us that that controller doesn't exist. Okay, so now we have an error. There is no sponsorable sponsorships controller. So let's generate that. Artisan make controller sponsorable sponsorships controller. And now if we run this, we should see that there's no new method on the controller. So we go up, new does not exist on that controller. So we'll go to the sponsorable sponsorships controller. We'll add a new method. We'll run this test again, and now we're going to get an error that data doesn't exist on the response. So in our base test case class, I'm going to add a setup method. So we'll add a protected function setup, and in here we'll just register some test macros that we only really care to have exist in the test environment. So if we take the test response, we can import that. And if you look at test response, it is macroable. So we can add methods to it, right? So I'm going to add a macro called data. And data is basically, if inside here we dd this and run the tests, you'll see that we have an instance of this test response. Exception handler is not instantiable. What's going on here? Eliminate target. Eliminate contracts debug exception handler is not instantiable. That's weird because all I did was add a setup method. Oh, you know what? We have to call parent setup here. Duh. Okay. Let's run this test again. We should see this test response now. Okay, so we have this test response instance. If you look at the test response, you can see there's a method called get original, but it might be coming in from a trait original. Or maybe it actually just gets proxied down to the actual response. So if we look at the base response, which I think is Illuminate HTTP response, there's a get original. No, maybe this one has traits. This original uses response trait. Okay, response trait original. So you can call get original content to get the original response content, but the original response, which is whatever was directly returned from the controller, actually is just public, so we can just access it. Yeah, TDD is a little bit of work, but if I wasn't like having to talk through everything that I was doing here, it wouldn't take very long at all. Like, it's actually faster for me to do it this way than it is to do it any other way. So, okay, if we DD the original, we're going to see that we get null because the controller doesn't return anything, right? But if this was a view, so if we look at Illuminate view, you can see that there's like a get data method where you can get all the data that was passed to the view. So we can finish this macro off by basically assuming that this was a view. Like, you could try and write this in some clever way, but we're going to make the assumption that we're only going to access this on views. We can return this original, get data, and then access a specific key. And again, you could write this in like a more robust, bulletproof way. You're going to get errors if the key doesn't exist and stuff. But since it's just for testing, and you sort of want it to error if that key doesn't exist, and I think it's fine. Okay, so call the member function get data on null. So what this error is telling us is that we're trying to get the data from the response, but the response is actually returning null. So in this case, we're going to want to return a view. So let's return view sponsorable sponsorships dot new, since that's the resource that we're returning. So if we run this again, we're going to get an error that view doesn't exist. So let's head over to resources, views. We'll create a new folder here called sponsorable sponsorships. And in here, we'll create a new file called new.blade.php. And here we'll run this test again, and now we're getting an undefined index sponsorable slots. Okay, so heading back to the controller, I disagree with basically all these comments in the chat. I think TDD is worth it for basically everything. The only time where it's a problem is if you're slow at it. And I can understand if you're not good at TDD why you would want to avoid it. But once you get good at it, it's basically faster to do almost anything with tests because you don't have to load up the browser. You don't have to do any of that stuff. Like, we haven't done any of this stuff in the browser yet, and we're going to be able to run a single command that can prove this works forever. Okay, so we're going to want to pass some data to this view, right? So we're going to have some sponsorable slots. And for now, why don't we say that should be equal to a sponsorable slots variable that we haven't defined? Just kind of that wishful thinking programming again. So now we're getting an error that there is no sponsorable slots variable. So let's head back to the sponsorable sponsorships controller. And now we have to think about like where are we going to get these sponsorable slots from. So let's think it through. Okay, so sponsorable slots is going to equal something. And what I would do here is, again, use that sort of programming by wishful thinking approach where we're going to make up a method, like some way that we want to be able to get this. And if we can't get it that way, well, then we're going to write other tests to show us how to get it. You don't have to know about the failure cases beforehand. TDD doesn't mean like you're automatically going to have perfect code with no bugs. You can add those regression tests for bugs that you don't know about later. It's just about like helping you. It's just about like taking responsibility out of your brain and offloading it to the computer, so you don't have to constantly be thinking about how does this affect this? How does this affect this? How does this affect this? You just can just throw stuff at the wall and see what gets the tests passing. Yeah. So, okay. So where are we going to get the sponsorable slots from? I think we're going to get them from taking a sponsorable that we should have somehow and basically just asking for these slots, right? And now I don't want to ask for just the unsponsored slots yet. That's going to be a different test. So we'll just start with this approach. Okay, so we'll write this. Now we're getting an error that there is no sponsorable. So we'll head back to the sponsorships controller and we have to think, okay, well, how are we going to get the sponsorable? So we're going to have a sponsorable eloquent model, I figure. And if you look at the test, the only information we have about it is its slug. So we're going to want some sort of method like find by slug. So why don't we call it like find or fail by slug? And yeah, that's fine. We'll follow like Eloquent's naming conventions, but we'll write tests to make sure that this actually throws an exception if it doesn't find it. And we'll pass through the slug. We're going to get an error that there is no slug variable, or actually a syntax error, unexpected, because I write too much JavaScript and I forget that we have to use semicolons. Okay, so no sponsorable class, right? Okay, so to fix that error, we can go artisan make model sponsorable. Okay, and now we can import that class, run the test again, and now we get an error that there is no slug variable. Okay, so the slug variable is going to be a route parameter, so we can accept that here. We're going to run this test again. And now we're getting an error, find or fail by slug does not exist. So we could just drive this out from this level, or we could drop down to the unit level to do it. So I think dropping down to the unit level is probably a good idea here. So why don't we do artisan make test sponsorable test -- unit to generate a test just for the specific class. We'll delete the example test here, and now we're in sort of an inner TDD loop where we're working on a unit test for a specific class as part of implementing a higher level feature. So let's do a test for finding a sponsorable by slug. So if we want to write this backwards, we're going to want to do something like this: assert true, something like sponsorable, or something like found sponsorable is sponsorable. Okay, so this is going to fail, right? Because there is no found sponsorable. So found sponsorable is going to come from calling sponsorable find or fail by slug, and then we'll pass through slugs. Let's use full stack radio as our example here. This is going to error because of a namespace import, so let's pull that in. Find or fail by slug does not exist, so let's head over to the sponsorable eloquent model, and let's just add a static function find or fail by slug that takes a slug, and we'll just have this do nothing for now. So back to our test, we'll run this again. Call member function is on null, so this actually has to return something. So let's make sure that we know what we want it to match. So let's create that using a factory first. So let's say that the sponsorable is going to equal factory, sponsorable class, create, and we'll make sure that we specify the slug. And we could probably one line. And we'll make the slug full stack radio. Okay, so let's run this test again. Now we're going to get an error that there is no factory. So if we head over to database, factories, I still kind of like Laravel's old approach, at least to start, where you just have like a model factory that you have a bunch of different factories defined in. So let's just copy this user one. We'll probably use the user one later. And we'll just define a new factory called app sponsorable. And we'll just make that empty for now until our tests tell us we have to do something. Okay, access denied. So right now we have a problem where everything is trying to connect to Homestead and stuff like that, like the default stuff. So let's make sure that in our PHP unit setup here, we configure DB database to be, what is it? Is it DB config database? I can never remember the name of these keys. DB connection and DB database. Okay, so we want DB connection. We'll use a SQLite in memory database to start here. And this will be DB database. Okay, so let's run this test again. I think it's still going to fail because it's not using the refresh database trait. So there is no sponsораbles table. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to call use refresh database to make sure that it's actually trying to set up the database. We're still going to get no such table sponsораbles. So now we can make a migration called create sponsораbles table -- create equals sponsораbles. And now if we go to the create sponsораbles table, have that open, run our test again, get an error that there's no slug column. So let's add a slug column. So we'll say table string slug. And we'll run this test again. Call the member function is on null. So now we can finally head back to the actual sponsorable and we can write the actual code. So all we have to do is return self where slug matches slug first. And if we run this test should pass. And it does, so that's good. Let's add another case for when it's not found. An exception is thrown if a sponsorable cannot be found by slug. So we'll just get rid of this, and here we'll just throw, this is the way that I like to do exception testing in PHP unit. I like to catch the specific exception. So in this case, I want a model not found exception. And what I basically want to do is I want to try and look for sponsorable. And we'll just say slug that does not exist. And we'll catch the exception, but if the exception is not thrown by this method, then we want to fail. So we can say this fail expected an exception or exception was not thrown even though sponsorable could not be found by slug. Cool. So let's see. Do we need to make any sort of assertions here? We probably don't have to. I'm just trying to think, like, is there anything that we could even really assert? We might get an error from PHP unit complaining, not an error, but a warning saying like there was no like assertion thrown. But let's just see. I'm trying to think if there's a way to handle that in a more nice way. Is there a pass method in PHP unit? No. I'm trying to think. Is there anything that we could assert? We could make an assertion about the exception, but like there's not really anything useful to do there. Like maybe a simple way to do this is just to, we'll catch like a base exception. And we'll just say like this assert instance of model not found exception class E. It's kind of like a workaround just to like have an assertion, but that's okay. Failed asserting that assertion failed object is an instance of model not found exception, so that's okay. So now we'll go back here and we'll just say first or fail, and that should be enough to kind of get this test passing. Okay, so this test is passing. This whole file is passing. Now if we head up to the new sponsorship test and run this test, we should be onto a different error. Okay, so there's no such table sponsораbles. Okay, so we got to do the same thing here that we did in the other test. We have to make sure that we use the refresh database trait. So let's head down here and we'll run this test again. And now we have no query results for model app sponsorable. So that means that we have to actually create that sponsorable, right? So let's say sponsorable equals factory sponsorable class create. And we'll give this a slug of full stack radio. and run this again. Okay, so we got to make sure that we import that class. Argument error, assert count must be countable or iterable. So I think the problem that we're getting is sponsorable slots is coming back as null. So we can double check that here by just going dd. Okay, so that's coming back as null. Yeah, you can use expected exception, or you could do expect exception at the top. I just find, like, in this case it didn't really pan out to be useful, but a lot of the time what'll happen is that in the catch you want to make other assertions about how the state of the system should be after that failure, which you can't easily do if you just use expected exception. But yeah, we could do that. Like, maybe we'll just write that in this case. This expected, or is it expected exception, expect exception? So we could do this. We could just expect that exception, and then, you know, we could comment out basically all this stuff. And if we run that, that should still pass. So in this case, you know what, this is probably the better way to do this, but it is useful to use that other structure in situations where you need to make other assertions other than just that the exception was thrown. But in this case, since that's the only thing that we care about, I think this is cool. A lot of time you might want to verify that, like, no additional records were added to the database or something, but in like an idempotent sort of get thing like this, that's totally fine. Okay, so we have this error where sponsorable slots is null. So let's take a look at our controller and think about, like, why would sponsorable slots be null? So if we head over to the sponsorships controllers, blah, 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 you can see we're fetching sponsorable by its slug, then we're asking for its slots. And that's what's coming back as null. So I think to get any sponsorable slots, we're going to want to make sure that we have some sponsorable slots created, right? So I think the next thing that I would do is I would create those probably here. So I would probably do something like sponsorable slots equals, and then I would probably do a new eloquent collection, and we'll do a new collection, and then I can change the alias, because Laravel has two types of collections. I think it's nice to be specific when I'm working with eloquent collections. So we'll use this as eloquent collection, and we'll create this new collection from a couple of sponsorable slots. So we want to have 3 sponsorable slots, and we want to make sure that they're equal to the specific ones, right? So you could just use like a factory and do like ×3 or whatever, which I think is okay. A lot of time you want to specify data that's different for each one, though. So I kind of try and use a consistent approach where I just kind of create each one manually. So let's make a sponsorable slot. We'll create it, and we'll specify that the sponsorable ID should be from this sponsorable. So we're trying to set up like a belongs to and has many relationship here. So we'll just kind of create 3 of those. So we're going to get an error because that class doesn't exist. So let's create that model. Artisan make model sponsorable slot. And let's import that class and run it again. And now we get an error that there's no factory for that model. So we'll head back here. And this is empty, right? Which might seem weird, but our tests haven't forced us to define anything here yet. So it's totally fine that that's empty. So I have a sponsorable slot model here. And again, I'm not going to fill it in until we actually are forced to. That's the wrong test. Okay, so no table. So let's make sure that we generate a migration for that. So artisan make migration, create sponsorable slots table -- create equals sponsorable slots. Okay, sponsorable slots has no column named sponsorable ID. So this is cool, right? Our tests are sort of telling us what we're supposed to do here. So create sponsorable slots table. So this needs to have a sponsorable ID, and we'll make it an unsigned integer since it's a foreign key. Okay, so must be countable or iterable. So now we have to set up this relationship, right? Because we're still getting null back even though that stuff is created. So if you look at the sponsorships controller, we're expecting to be able to ask for just slots and get those back. So let's create a has many relationship here called slots, and make this point to sponsorable slot. Assert equals does not exist on the Eloquent collection. So let's write the macro for being able to compare two Eloquent collections. So I've done this on a couple projects and it's proven to be pretty useful. I can kind of explain how I do this. So we'll take the Eloquent collection here. Basically, sometimes you just want to be able to say, like, are these two Eloquent collections, like, do they contain the same models in the same order, you know? So we're going to macro the Eloquent collection, and let's just grab this import statement here. And we're going to give this an assert equals macro that only exists in the test environment. And it'll receive some items as its arguments. And basically, there's like PHP unit has like assert equals. These things exist on the assert class in PHP unit. So here, if we wanted to, we could do something like assert and import this PHP unit framework assert. And maybe the first thing that we want to check to make sure that these two Eloquent collections are the same is to do something like assert count items. Assert count items. Oh, I'm brain farting on which order things are supposed to go in. Expected should be first. So which one would be the expected? Interesting. They feel kind of equal. So we want to make sure this collection is this collection. So the expected value should be items, and then this for the next one. I'm going to sneeze, sorry. Ugh, that's the sickness. All right, so this assertion we actually like duplicated here. So I think we can remove it here once we kind of get it working here. Yeah, expected is first. I was just trying to figure out like which one of them is the expected one in this case. Is it the items that's coming in as the parameter, or is it the collection that we're calling the method on? Okay, so we want to make sure that there's three. So why don't we start maybe by commenting on this line, making sure that this is passing. Okay, so it's passing, so we do have three items there. If we comment out the three here and run this one, now we get an error, undefined method count, so it's assert count. Kind of redundant, but it's okay. Must be of type integer. So items count matches this. Okay, cool. So this test is passing, but it's not fully done. I want to add more information to this assertion to make sure that not only is the size the same, but that like the items actually match and they're in the same order. So once we kind of have this set up, here's a trick using a cool collection function. So there's a function in the collection called zip that basically takes two collections and kind of like mashes them together and pairs them each up. So if I do something like collect 1, 2, 3, and I zip that with 4, 5, 6, and I dump this result, you kind of understand what I'm saying. So we get a result where there's three items, and the first item is a pair that has 1 and 4, 2 and 5, 3 and 6. So you can see like 1 gets paired with 4, 2 gets paired with 5, and 3 gets paired with 6. So you can understand how this would be useful for comparing the items in the same positions in an Eloquent collection, right? So here we could say this zip with items, each function, and then we can't destructure in PHP because it's terrible. So we could say item pair, and then here we could say item, I guess we can just say assert true, item pair 0 is item pair 1. So if we run this test now, fail asserting that null is true, test case 26. Wonder why that's happening. I kind of was expecting this to pass, so let's see. So sponsorable slot. Oh, what am I doing here? Is. Okay, so now we're green. All right, so I think that's a good point to make a commit. So I think we can also get rid of without, no, we can keep without exception handling. You know what I'm going to do is I'm going to make without exception handling sort of our default state. Because I typically don't want Laravel's exception handling to run. I only want it to run in certain cases, which is where I'm relying on validation errors, or if I'm relying on like model not found exception stuff. So our test suite actually might, no, it still passes. Okay, cool. Yeah, because actually the situation I'm thinking of is when you want a model not found exception to be converted to a 404. Okay, so we've got one test written for viewing the new sponsorship page where we can basically verify that when we go to fullstackradio/sponsorship/new, that the sponsorable slots are passed through. I think one other thing that we should do here maybe is make another assertion. This isn't really required yet, but I think it will be useful for future iterations of this page. So we might as well do it. Let's add a response, assert true, response data sponsorable is the sponsorable. So let's make sure that we pass the sponsorable through to the view as well. So right now we don't. So if we head back to the sponsorable sponsorships controller, we can pass through just the sponsorable. So something I think is interesting to note here is I think what a lot of people would do is they would just pass the sponsorable through and then they would just call sponsorable slots in the view, which is the same, right? It results in the same code. The problem is that's harder to test in my experience and based on what we've done here, right? If we just pass the sponsorable to the view, we wouldn't have an easy way to test that the sponsorable slots that we were using in the view matched these specific ones without making a bunch of gross assertions about the contents of the HTML, which really sucks. So what I like to do is I like to be really explicit about the stuff that I'm passing to the view. I don't like to do a lot in the view logic wise. So even if I was passing through like a blog and blog posts, I wouldn't just pass through the blog and then ask for the posts from the blog in the view. I would pass through all the sort of top level data that the view needs directly, because then I can easily make assertions about the data that was passed to the view. And as long as, I'm not doing anything stupid in my views, going out of my way to make database queries and stuff like that, then I can feel really confident that my view is only going to be displaying kind of this sandboxed curated data that I send to the view. I don't add tests for indexes. I think of indexes and performance stuff as the refactoring step of TDD. So I just want to make sure that like the outcome is correct, and then I'll go through and apply performance optimizations if I want to, and just make sure that the tests that I already had still pass. I think it can be interesting to add some tests for performance reasons. Like it's not really traditional TDD in the sense, but I know like Dave Marshall, who's Dave Development on Twitter, who's really smart when it comes to this testing stuff, tweeted something the other day. Like a lot of time he likes to throw just a little kind of high level assertion onto a request that says like, make sure there was less than 10 database queries or something. And it's really just like an interesting way to spot opportunities for query optimizations and stuff like that. So that's definitely something that you could play with if you wanted to. Okay, so let's make a commit here. So we added a lot of stuff, but it's all kind of like a cohesive sort of feature. So let's just say, what are we going to call this commit? Test viewing the new sponsorship page. Cool. All right. I think that's probably a good place to stop for a quick break, like maybe like a 5-minute break, only because I think this will make a good video on its own. And I want people who aren't able to, watch this live to be able to go back on YouTube and sort of watch kind of each logical chunk step by step broken up into a handful of separate videos. So I'm going to take like a quick 5-minute break. Maybe not even that. Feel free to hang out in the chat still. And you'll see when the stream comes back up. And I'll probably tweet when I'm about to start back up again too. All right, so I'm going to stop the stream for a couple minutes and then we'll head back to it.